I thought I'd get there early for my meeting with the lawyer, but when I got there with my lawyer, Dave and his lawyer were already in the conference room. Dave was with an attractive woman, which made me feel jealous. I felt inferior to him. At 48, he was more handsome than at 20. He was tall and muscular. He owned a successful business and led the local chamber of commerce. I shuddered at the thought that if today didn't go well, I might never feel his comforting arms again. Dave barely acknowledged me as I followed my lawyer into the room. My face turned pale when the lawyer with red hair reached out to reassure him. I thought she was trying to quickly finish the meeting to pursue him. From experience, I knew she would enjoy it because my husband was skilled and knew how to use his charm. Dave smiled at her but remained neutral when he looked at me. I was frustrated by Dave's determination not to talk to me, so I had to attend the meeting while my lawyer chatted with the red-haired lawyer. I sat down, and Dave took a folder from my large purse, opened it, and laid out the finished 2-page script. Dave smiled a little, so I knew he was aware of my thorough preparation. He set up a laptop, plugged in speakers and put a single sheet of paper next to it. Then he put his hands on the table and looked at me with a polite but somewhat detached expression. There was no anger, no hate, and no grief. I had prepared for this meeting for 3 days. After days of memorizing my script, I used my knowledge of David Brown to appeal to his emotions. We gathered today to discuss Mrs. Julianne Brown, who has agreed to sign a divorce petition if Dave listens to her for at least an hour. If everyone is ready, I suggest we start the hour now, she said, turning the timer knob, and it began to tick loudly, emphasizing the room was silent. I was annoyed that Dave wanted lawyers there instead of a private meeting. I was going to share my feelings for the next 45 minutes before making Dave admit to something that would justify my inappropriate behavior. It was awkward with just the two of us, even more humiliating in front of strangers. Well, no. I decided to focus on the positives. I checked my notes and crossed my fingers, remembering my friend Sonia's advice. I cleared my throat and thanked Dave for meeting with me today. I acknowledged my mistake and explained that it wasn't related to his failure, but rather my own self. I'd spent days thinking about this, hoping Dave would see my honesty. I thought he wanted to forgive me, and my speech was meant to justify that. I thought about what might happen if the kids were at home. I considered playing the "you can't break up the family" card, confident it would work. I watched his reaction to my speech. I looked at his face and was surprised by his response in the silence that followed. Dave's expression was neutral. He didn't even look at me. He methodically raised his pen and marked a check next to the first sentence in his notes. My first words almost completely confused me. I said exactly what he expected, which made me lose confidence in my arrogance. I forgot that not only had I come up with my argument based on 30 years of knowing him, but he had spent those 30 years looking back at me. I'm not ashamed to admit I was shocked. I emphasized the importance of sticking to the script, reiterating that the situation with Dave was a result of my own foolish and self. I told him I felt lost without children, aged, unattractive and worthless. I also explained that I met Jason while working on a church committee. I said he was sophisticated and a skilled seducer who knew exactly how to win people over. He started acting like a friend after church meetings last year, listening to my problems. After a church meeting, Jason suggested going to a cafe. I agreed, thinking it was just a casual get-together with a friend. I didn't realize he was skilled at breaking through a woman's defenses. We progressed from coffee shops to restaurants, where he complained about his wife. I trusted him by then, but the restaurants became increasingly. We started going to more upscale places, and the gifts he gave me became more enjoyable. Dave, you can't imagine how nice it is when a guy 15 years younger than you tries to win you over. 4 months ago, he asked me to sleep with him, and I declined. I should have refused to meet him after that, when his intentions were clear. But by then I had become somewhat reliant on the effect his compliments and attention had on my ego and confidence. I was really affected by all this attention. I fell silent and started sniffling. I wiped my eyes with my finger, which I'd rubbed on an onion piece in my pocket. It stung so much that I didn't dare rub my other eye. 1 teary eye should have been enough. I stopped, started again, faltered and hesitated. I'm really ashamed that I didn't break up with him. He took me to a restaurant and bought a 1300. He had a bottle of Grange with him, even though he doesn't drink wine. I drank almost all of it. I'm pretty sure that's what he wanted. I was too nervous to resist him when we left the restaurant. He offered to take me home, and I foolishly agreed. Once in the driveway, he leaned over and kissed me, but I was too drunk to stop him. You know how I get after a couple of glasses of wine. At this point, he started touching my chest. My logic was completely broken, and I remember just thinking that I should move him out of the driveway so the neighbors wouldn't see us. I opened the garage door and forced him to park inside. I cheated a little by admitting that even in the car, I thought Jason might be staying a while, and I certainly didn't want the neighbors to see. I saw a strange car in the driveway the next morning. I knew it was a calculated risk, though. I understood that being betrayed was a major blow to a man's ego. I wanted Dave to ensure that no one else ever found out. Well, except for 2 lawyers. As the garage door was closing, Jason got out of the car and started kissing me again. I said I had. I'd already drunk most of a bottle of Grange and was pretty drunk. He grabbed my key and led me inside. I took him to one of the spare bedrooms. I'll be ashamed of this until the day I die. I let him do whatever he wanted with me. I'm so sorry, Dave. My only saving grace was that I was composed enough with him to get him to put on a safe. After Jason came, I think we both fell asleep. I was drunk and he was probably tired after a 4 or 5 month chase. I know for sure I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't drunk and depressed when I woke up. I definitely would have kicked him to the curb immediately. Instead, you entered the room and turned on the light. I have never been so ashamed in my life. The look of pain on your face just killed me. I realized how much misuse I had caused. I messed up and caused problems for us with one simple mistake. I was still crying and looked at my husband, who I've spent a lifetime with. I could read his expression like an open book and see how he felt about my request. His expression was neutral. He didn't even look at me. He was just fiddling with the laptop in front of him. I thought he was writing notes until he clicked the link on his screen. A voice came from the speakers. It was my voice, saying, "Don't kiss me, you smell of beer." I'd only had 1 glass of white wine. The audio clip stopped, and the room fell into a thunderous silence. I think that's how it was. The roaring sound in my head drowned out everything else. I felt embarrassed and I was pretty humiliated when Dave walked in on me that night with Jason, and then he lifted Jason by his hair and beat the crap out of him. But that was nothing compared to the fact that I'd just been caught in a huge lie. It threw me off track completely. I was so confident that my script would work. My eyes darted around the room. Dave's lawyer smiled slightly. Mine looked slightly embarrassed. Dave, he just looked at me with that blank expression. I still don't know why I didn't realize what it all meant. Dave had an audio recording of my meeting with Jason that night, which was wound up. I never thought to follow the logic of it. Why does he need a voice recorder? If he didn't know in advance that he could record something, what else? Did we say the silence stretched uncomfortably for a long time? I looked at the cryptic shand in my notes and, looking back, stupidly plunged into the script I had prepared. I clung to him like a drowning man clings to debris. It was only once, and it won't happen again. Nothing like that, please believe me. I just wasn't strong enough to resist him, but I wasn't so out of control that I wouldn't force him to use protection or let him take me to our bed. He wanted it, but I would never do that, no matter how drunk I was. We were in Megan's old room, and Dave just looked at me sadly. I didn't know what was worse, his sad face or his impassive one. He shook his head and turned to the computer. I felt rather than heard him double-click the icon, and I cringed until I asked him to use protection or take me to bed. He wanted it, but I would never do that, no matter how drunk I was. We were in Megan's old room. Dave just looked at me sadly. I didn't know what was worse, his sad face or his impassive one. He shook his head and turned to the computer. I felt rather than heard him double-click the icon. I cringed until I just like to watch how you lie. In front of me, full of desire, it is very hot. Then, once it's finished, another double click and Jason's voice again. When can we have time in bed again in your clueless husband's bed? It was so cool this time. Dave clicked and ended the clip and then just looked at me silently, accusatory. What could I even say? Everything I claimed was debunked, not by Dave but by my own words. Protection. It was a one-time thing. It was a drunken mistake. I didn't get close to my husband in our own bed. The whole thing fell apart in just 30 words. I'm speechless, though. It was awkward. I looked at Dave for any clue, but his neutral gaze revealed nothing. I noticed my lawyer checking her watch, which made me focus on that I had 60 minutes to salvage my marriage, and I was going terribly. I forced myself to suppress panic and apologize for the lie about it being the first time. I just didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. I thought if I could convince you it was a one-off. I know it's a bit of a long story, but I think if I explain it to you, you'll understand why I did what I did. I went back into silence. Should I tell you that I was seeing Jason quite often for over 6 months? Well, I didn't know what Dave knew. He'd recorded conversations, and he knew it wasn't the first or only time we'd met. But what else did he know? I was hiding the recorder where I usually did with Jason, which made him think I was hiding something. I just didn't know, but I knew that if I was caught telling one. I'm going to be frank with you, Juliana. It's time to be vague, avoid details, and stick to the facts. The truth is that Jason did seduce me, and it took a while. He has a thing for older women. I'll admit that being pursued by a man almost my kid's age gave me an ego boost. However, I was weak and thought about saying I used the master bed only once the first time, but that would be a lie and put me in a better light. However, not knowing how long Dave knew about my extramarital activities held me back. I decided I couldn't stay silent on this, though. I realized I had limited time to rectify the situation and was unsure of the best course of action. So I turned my attention to my notes. I discarded the initial points after being exposed and focused on the words highlighted in capital letters. I conveyed that I never ceased to love and respect Dave, and that I gave him no less love than I always had. I also explained that Jason was an additional dimension that didn't diminish anything from that. I told him I still loved Dave, but that I felt my love for him had grown in intensity. I could even say it had become overwhelming. When I fell silent, Dave looked back at his laptop screen, frowned, and seemed confused for a moment. He eventually relaxed again, listening to the recording of the earlier soundtrack. I could tell from his frown that he was searching for an icon on the screen. He finally realized it was one of the open files. It would have been better if he hadn't found out. I started over, going back to the beginning of the video. I revisited Jason's question about being close in our marital bed like the first time. I cringed, knowing my words once again condemned me. I said, I already told you never again, not after the last time that night. Dave stepped out of the shower and inadvertently stepped on a large drop of white. I was grateful for this, as it meant I could explain about sneezing. I told him I was sorry, but I had sneezed and the drop of white was my snot sinking lower into the seat. I anticipated that I knew what was coming next, but I felt pretty smug when I said it at first. That feeling went away when I distracted Dave by offering to clean his leg and doing it well. That got his attention. I said, you have to admit, doll, that your husband sometimes acts like an ignorant idiot. We talked about how we managed to avoid detection, like when he had to hide in the closet when Dave came home early. I thought it was sweet that he trusted me so much. Now he's just an ignorant fool. Sometimes I wonder if we could have sex right here while he's in the room. The mocking tone made me realize I was rehashing an old argument with these words and such a tone. I couldn't even convince myself I loved and respected my husband, let alone him again. I was confused before this meeting. I convinced myself I loved and respected Dave, but after what I did and said, how is that possible? We were all silent after the final argument. Dave turned to look at me, but I couldn't look him in the face, so I turned to his lawyer. She had such contempt on her face that I knew she didn't see Dave as just another client. I looked away from her and now looked at my lawyer. She was just as disdainful as the last one. I was fighting for my future, but it felt like I was surrounded by people who didn't support me. I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. My confidence dissipated like dew in the midday sun. I quickly realized that I needed to take control of the situation. I decided to adopt an offensive stance and told Dave that over the last 6 months he had been paying me less and less attention, taking me for granted, traveling for business more frequently, and seemingly distancing himself from me. All of this had happened at the same time. With the kids leaving home, I felt lost. I told Dave how he was never there when I needed him. He didn't reassure me about my age or attractiveness, or provide comfort when I needed it. I noticed Dave's eyes returning to his screen, and I cringed as his fingers danced, opening the selected file. It became apparent that Jason's words were from just after our second encounter that fateful night, shortly before Dave reached a breaking point. He spoke about our recent lack of bed life and expressed his desire for more frequent encounters. He mentioned a canceled trip and how I had requested him to limit Dave's diet. Jason explained that he only had the opportunity that night. Dave had to attend an urgent meeting, so he also said he wished Dave would leave town more often. "Well, I want more," retorted an irritated Jason, and the clip was once again interrupted. I lowered my eyes to the table, avoiding 3 judgmental glances, and recalled my emotional state during the last conversation. The thing was, the excitement of having a lover, even one as young and energetic as Jason, was starting to wear off for Jason. My actions in betraying my husband had caused me to lose respect for Dave, and it was starting to bother me. I think my emotional distance was mostly down to a lack of respect for Dave. From my husband, even as I prepared for this meeting, fully intending to blame him for pulling away from me, I realized that it was a lie to allow myself to continue to betray him. I emotionally divorced Dave. Cutting him off in bed was an easy decision, simply because Dave's lovemaking was so different from Jason's. It was impossible to confuse the two, which reinforced to me that what I was doing was very wrong. So I began to reject my husband's advances. Well, he pressed for a while, then he stopped. I suddenly realized that it should have been screaming for my attention months ago. Dave suddenly gave up his bed and his life around the same time he began working longer hours. I was also confused about why he was distancing himself from me. Then something clicked. Dave must have known for a long time that he had to hide the recorder in Megan's room. My entire approach was wrong. I went to this meeting to try to minimize my crime, to help Dave to heal his wounded pride, and to eat humble pie. I thought I was calming a recently wounded bull, but if I was right about him knowing at least 2 weeks before he discovered and confronted me, then he was a lot more cunning than I thought. I was wasting my time trying to get through to him emotionally. In short, I had no idea what to do. I'm much better at planning than being spontaneous, hence the 2 pages of notes. But I had to do something, time was running out. The ticking clock confirmed this, so I took my notes and began to look for hope. My head was so full of other things that I found it really difficult to absorb the words. Then I realized that the recordings were a red herring because the game had changed so much. If Dave knew I was leaving for a while, what was his state of mind? Of course he was offended by my betrayal, but most of all he was worried about my motivation. Wasn't I satisfied? Given the quantity and quality of his lovemaking, I find him boring and want to explore my kinky side. Did I love Jason? Was I really going to run away with him? I could risk looking into those expressionless eyes and wondering if I should lie again. If only I could remember what else Jason and I talked about. I really wish I could be sure that this was the only night David recorded. Of course, the sequence had to be suspect. Install recorders, resist. He couldn't be sure of this for long, he just wasn't a good actor. I really wanted to convince him of the truth. I still loved and respected him. My desperate desire for him to believe me proved this. It was far beyond my fear of losing my comfortable lifestyle, but how do I convince him that I respect him? After all, we've all heard me call him and goofy in front of my lover. What's the point of trying to justify denigrating him to my lover as a way of justifying myself to my conscience and creating a common bond between Jason? He proved he wouldn't abandon me. It was more than just my fear of losing my comfortable lifestyle. But how do I convince him that I respect him? After we've all heard me call him and goofy in front of my lover, what's the point of trying to justify denigrating him to my lover as a way of justifying it to my conscience? It would create a common bond between Jason and me. And me? I don't think that applies to love for him either. If I'd caught him deceiving me, I don't think I could have convinced myself otherwise. So it'll take time to convince him that I love and respect him. I did manage to convince him not to insist that I immediately sign the divorce papers. I had to get the divorce papers signed, but how long would it take to convince him of this one thing? I was pretty sure my next few sentences were going to be important, so I took a deep breath and looked across the table at Dave. I told him that I understood he thought I'd lost interest. I told him I still loved and respected him, and that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. I said that Jason was a distraction and that I didn't love him. I told Dave that I never meant to run away with Jason. I admitted that I was wrong to do what I did, especially when Jason asked me to limit our closeness. I said that I didn't know why I did it, especially after I'd convinced myself that I was just giving Jason something that Dave couldn't handle. I also said that Jason didn't have the experience or stamina that Dave did. My actions were driven by lust and selfishness. Although the physical aspect brought a temporary satisfaction, it was devoid of any genuine emotion. I also explained that I didn't engage in the same perversions with Jason that I had denied Dave over the years. It felt like time was slowing down, like it was moving in slow motion, like everyone around me was disintegrating. I was moving at a normal speed to my left when my lawyer expressed her disdain, tossing her pen on the table and turning to me. It was evident that in this moment I couldn't even pay someone to be on my side. Dave's lawyer leaned to the side to gain a better view of the laptop screen, revealing that I realized that Dave wasn't playing sound files as I'd assumed, but rather video clips. This made the situation seem even more serious. Dave's wife grabbed his hand in a show of support, but even though he wasn't looking at me, I could tell from his reaction that he felt betrayed. I saw him look devastated for a second and then a tear rolled down his cheek. I wondered if he was really suffering or if he just got lost in the screen amidst all the chaos. A few things registered in my mind: the recording. The recording was made at least 3 weeks before the collision, which meant Dave had been aware of my betrayal for some time. He had enough information to discern a pattern. As the speakers played, the heat that had once suffused the room transformed into a sense of dirtiness, sloppiness, and tastelessness. I was focused on the table and my lawyer laid out the divorce papers before me. I was helpless. I couldn't counter the vile behavior that Dave had uncovered with ease. He dismantled all my rationalizations, minimizations, and feeble attempts at reconciliation. It was over. Dave was acting as an orchestra. The conductor didn't say a word today. Instead, he showed the orchestra which section he wanted to play next, using his skills and talents to execute a silent symphony of separation. No, it wasn't Dave. I ascended the scaffold myself, blindfolded and with a noose in hand, kicking the lever. Dave simply set up the scaffold and left as soon as he played the last clip. He knew exactly what I was going to say, so there was no way I could make amends. When I came up with my arguments, based on my closeness to him and my knowledge of him after observing him for 3 decades, I forgot that he also looked. She looked at me for the same amount of time, her eyes sharp and piercing. I felt ashamed and humiliated, and finally, I ran away. I needed to escape. I needed to go back to the house that was still my home, at least until Dave got the eviction notice. I signed the 2 agreements and threw them away in one fluid motion. I was surprised that my lawyer said the business wasn't worth more, and by that time Dave had hidden most of it. The last recording had ended and the ticking silence returned. My lawyer took the signed papers and gave me a copy while placing the rest in her briefcase. She left the room, leaving me sitting there, frozen, torn between the desire to run and the wish to convey a positive message. I was longing for a glimmer of hope, something to convince myself that there might be a chance to rekindle the flame someday, to let Dave know that I still cared about his well-being. The sound of an alarm clock made me jump up and say my positive phrase. The jackal was holding Dave's hand and telling him not to seek revenge on Jason. She was worried about never being able to forgive herself if he ended up in prison. Dave replied with another damning video, but it wasn't featuring my voice. It was another woman's, and she was speaking in an almost shrill tone. If his brothers got to him first. I thought about how Jason's silence after the beating reflected fear on his part, but now I wondered if being divorced and penniless might be a fitting end for the scammer. I felt guilty as I considered that he might die because he had been involved with me as I prepared to leave. I couldn't bear to look Dave in the face. I wondered whether he was laughing or crying. It was a constant reminder of the misuse I had caused this good man. He had lost everything except my house and money and suffered a tremendous emotional blow all at my hands. I deserved every bit of his anger. Through tears, I managed to squeeze out a feeble goodbye. As I shuffled towards the door, I felt like I was leaving behind a part of myself. My feeble attempt to salvage my old life was discarded like a plague beetle. Perhaps my daughter Megan would visit me while I drowned myself in oblivion, or if she wasn't available, then my son Joel. Just as I began to push the door, voices behind me caught my attention. It was another damn recording. An excited young male voice accused cheater. A very familiar female voice intervened, asking, "Are you sure, Dad? I think I'll drink alone today."